Hey, I'm Rob Simopoulos from Defendify, and I'm really excited today to have a great conversation here with Sid Bose from Ice Miller. I'm also joined with Shanna Utgard. Why don't we start off with some intros? Shanna, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll move over to Sid.
I am Shanna Utgard. I'm the success manager at Defendify. Today, I am going to be playing Vanna and turning the letters, or more so, responding to questions into Rob and Sid.
Excellent. I already mentioned that we have Sid Bose here from Ice Miller joining us. And Sid, why don't you take the mic and tell us a little bit about your history and your background and how you got to where you are today.
Well, Rob, thanks again for having me. It's always a pleasure doing this with you guys. Hi, everyone. My name is Sid Bose. I am an attorney at Ice Miller. I work in our firm's data security and privacy group. And prior to me becoming an attorney, I've been an attorney for 6 years now. Prior to that, I worked in IT doing a variety of roles, everything from sysadmin to performance engineering. So building up a lot on my IT background, and then came to the other dark side, decided to be a lawyer. And so here we are today. We'll be talking more about what I do on a day-to-day basis as we go, and how we partner with folks like Defendify on various cool projects when it comes to data security and privacy. So thanks for being here.
Hey, that's great. Thanks, Sid. Sid, I got to ask you a crazy question. Have you ever met an attorney who came out of the IT realm before, or are you the only one here in the world?
You know, it's funny enough. My boss actually did come out in a similar career path. He used to work cybersecurity, another company, and he made his way into law as well. And so there's not a lot of us out there, but it's, I think, increasingly becoming a new career track for a lot of individuals. They start out in IT and go into law, just given the natural intersection where law and IT is heading towards.
Yeah, oh, definitely a massive need. All right, my first question for you surrounds about what you folks do at Ice Miller. I think that when we talk about law firms, especially when we talk about data security, there are a wide array of different things that you can do or you are doing with your customers. Do you mind sharing some of the places where you're helping folks today?
Sure. It's a great question. My practice sort of works on two tracks. On the first track is, what we just traditionally think of as incident response, right? So you have a data breach, and all that goes with it. That's one of the areas that we focus heavily on. But in the last couple of years, the second track is sort of becoming more and more involved, and that's more on the what I think of as compliance and sort of the everything before the boom, if you will. So if you think about all the compliance activities that goes about with respect to standing up an information security program, assessing an information security program, doing contracts, negotiating contracts, everything that's sort of outside of the incident response work. That's the second track that we're focusing on, and that's being increasingly growing the last couple of years, just because cybersecurity and privacy is becoming a sharper focus for a lot of organizations.
Well, I think that's refreshing, first off, because it sounds like people are becoming more aware that they need to be prepared that something might occur and deal with these things up front, compared to just being reactive after an incident's occurred. I think that's great to hear. Speaking about that, one of the things, a huge trend that we're seeing here with small and mid-sized businesses is really their customers doing third-party vendor assessments on them. And what I mean by that is, a lot of small to mid-sized companies do business with large enterprises. They might be their top customer. They might have one or two of those. And we know that those enterprise organizations have pretty sophisticated security teams. And those groups are doing risk assessments on their customers, or on their vendors, and understanding that, hey, this vendor who we work with, they're actually a threat to us. They get some of our sensitive information. Perhaps they have access to our networks and so on. And so what they're doing is they're doing, assessments on them to ensure that their cybersecurity is up to snuff and meeting the things that they need, that they require inside of their business. Are you seeing that happening? Are you talking to your customers about that? And is the frequency increasing from your perspective?
Rob, that is a great question. And yes, absolutely. In the last, I'd say 18 months or so, supply chain security is what I like to think of it. The idea that, every organization, every company almost always is partnering with another third party or another vendor or another supplier. And managing that supply chain security, if you will, is becoming more and more critical. It's not a new concept. If you think back to the old Target days, right, when Target had its data breach, everybody knows the name Target, but what many people might not know is the pundits believe that the origination of the Target data breach was actually from an HVAC vendor that had access to Target's networks. So going back to that was almost 10 years ago. Going back to then, we already started to see supply chain issues. And then in the last couple of months, we've had various cases, most recently being the SolarWinds incident, where, it's a good example of how a supply chain issue can become a vulnerability to the larger enterprise. So from, small to mid-sized vendors and suppliers, their customers all of a sudden are taking a more deliberate focus towards ensuring supply chain security. And as a consequence of that, there's more and more information security requirements that they're being pushed down, and as a result of that, a lot of the smaller and mid-sized businesses are also having to shore up their information security program and being able to position themselves in a way that they can support their customers' information security requirements and so forth.
Right, Sid. So I know you've seen a lot of what these questionnaires and assessments look like, and we've seen quite a few over here at Defendify as well. Quite often the way that they're worded can be complicated to, a non-security specialist. And I'm a little concerned about organizations just getting those policies or those questionnaires and just checking, yes, we have these controls in place.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it that they're, filling those assessments out properly and accurately and ensuring those controls in place?
Sure. So that's a great question, Rob. And usually, traditionally, where these security questionnaires rear themselves up is either in the diligence phase or in the contracting phase, right? So, let's say you have a potential customer that's looking to do business with you, and that customer might come to you with a security questionnaire as part of their diligence and say, answer these questions. That's one prong. And then if you get past that, when you get to the actual point of where you're entering into a contract or trying to enter into a contract, that contract document, for example, will have a special addendum to it and reciting certain cybersecurity requirements. And that's the second place that usually rears its head. Now, in both these situations, it's becoming more and more critical to be able to ensure you answer those questions accurately and clearly. The reason for that is oftentimes, ultimately, when you sign that contract, your customer is going to want to bind you to the representations and which the statements that you've made in those responses. Just recently, for example, we had an example where my client was the customer. They were trying to contract with a small to mid-sized supplier. And in that, the vendor made representations about where they had disk encryption. They said, we have disk encryption across the board anytime we have data at rest. It turns out, they had an incident. It turns out, that wasn't always the case. There were significant portions of the environment where the data was not encrypted, and as a consequence of that, my client wanted to hold their supplier's feet to the fire and saying, hey, when we entered into this agreement, when we went through the diligence, you made representations to us that you would have at-rest encryption across the board and that our data would be protected. And when that didn't happen, clearly our client was really upset and wanted to go after the vendor. But that's just one example. Those security requirements are expanding, becoming even more intense, receiving a lot more scrutiny. So depending on who you are and the types of services you do for your customers, you're going to start to see more and more of those requirements flow down towards you.
Exactly. Great point. I just want to talk for 1 second around. I don't want to get deep into SolarWinds because I think it's way too early to talk about the things that have occurred there. I think you agree with me, right, Sid?
I definitely agree with you, Rob. I think SolarWinds is still a black box as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if I know the full facts. Well, actually, I'm pretty certain I don't know the full facts.
Right, true. But where I do want to go is just looking at that incident, and the way it occurred, and the fact that I think people forget that cybersecurity is pretty unique in the sense that it has a one-to-many effect. If one organization is breached, chances are they're storing sensitive information about an organization. Maybe in the SolarWinds case, perhaps they were building software that's being used by end users. We've had many conversations about, IT providers having remote access to different customer sites and so on. And that sort of chain effect can be devastating if you really think about it from a supply chain perspective. When people are setting these things up and they're deploying their cybersecurity, ensuring that their own business is protected, in the end, they really need to ensure that they're helping protect their customers and their partners and their vendors. What's the legal impact if, somebody doesn't do those things properly and they do have a cyber breach?
That's a great question, and that is quite literally a lawyer answer, right? It depends. Usually typically, let's say I'm representing the customer and it's their supplier that had an incident. I usually look at what sort of recourse we have against the supplier, and that's usually driven by the contract, right? The contract that we sign with the other party. If depending on how sophisticated the other side is, or how much leverage you as the customer has, you want to negotiate fairly robust terms when it comes to information protection, incident response. What activities the supplier is going to take when it comes to an incident, and obviously, what type of legal recourse or that you can have against them. So, for example, who's going to pay the bills when it comes to hiring forensics? If you found out that there was a data breach at the supplier, and all of a sudden you have to provide notifications to impacted individuals, who's going to foot the bill for those pieces of paper that have to go out? And that's one example, right? And then on the legal and regulatory side, let's say you are a hospital, for example, and you have a supplier that you use, and they have access to PHI. If they have a data breach, all of a sudden the regulatory bodies and the regulatory authorities might be looking to you to say, hey, did you maintain adequate supervision over your vendor and your supplier? What type of an agreement did you have in place with this vendor and supplier to ensure that they are having good security practices and ensuring that they're having good privacy practices? So you can have a legal and regulatory impact as well, depending on what type of a company you are. And those sort of are the two big areas that I usually focus on, or I try to educate clients on, is understand what your business partners are asking you to risk, and understand where your legal and regulatory risks come from.
Yeah, excellent, great. Let's move on to the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which is, let's hope it never happens to an organization or anybody who's on here watching one of these webinars. But if something does happen, if there is a cyber incident that occurs, what are the legal sides in regards to reporting an incident? And I'm going to let you go, because I know that there's a few different ways, or a few different key impacts here that might be into play. But I'll let you go with it, Sid. What should people really be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. And I'd always encourage people to have a good incident response plan in play. When you think about all the different areas when it comes to IT and cybersecurity, an incident response plan oftentimes is sort of the forgotten child, if you will. And that's where it's very important. When I say an incident response plan, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. Just little things like, do you know who to contact if there's an incident? Do you know what route you're going to do to have escalation? Do you know which teams within your organization you're going to consult with, or who you're going to loop in? The reason why an incident response plan is becoming more and more important is a couple of reasons. One, there's laws that are changing with respect to how long you have to investigate an incident and how much time you have to report to impacted individuals if, let's say, personal information was involved. Here in the United States, for example, you have 50 different states, which means you have 50 different state laws, and each of those state laws might have different reporting timelines. In some states, you have 30 days to report to an impacted individual. Some states you have 45, or maybe in other situations you have 60. For any of our listeners here today who work in the international space, the GDPR is a great example. Under the GDPR, you have to report a data breach in under 72 hours, so 3 days. And Rob, I'm sure you've been in a dozen or more, well, not a dozen, thousands of these incidents, where I'm sure you can appreciate 72 hours, basically 3 days, is not a lot of time to be able to go through and assess your security incident, get your bearings straight, and start to determine what your legal obligations are. But time is of the essence, ultimately. That's the key takeaway here, is having a good incident response plan is going to make sure you act accordingly, respond properly, and minimize the time. Because the longer you take, the chances are the worse it's going to get for you.
That goes back also to what you shared earlier in regards to your customers having agreements with you in place about reporting as well, because we've seen them where you have to report an incident to the customer within 24 hours, which is very difficult to respond to. You're still sort of figuring things out at that point in time.
Exactly, Rob. You hit it right on the point there. We're increasingly seeing in those security agreements we talked about from customers, they're also requiring obligations in there of their suppliers and vendors to notify them of security incidents. And as a party that's on the receiving end of that, you have to be cognizant of that, because the last thing you want to do is end up in a situation where not only have you had a data breach, but you failed your reporting obligations to your customers, and as a consequence of that, you're now in breach of a contract with those customers.
Yeah.
So it's important to be able to understand, as part of your incident response plan, what types of legal obligations you have, what kind of contractual obligations you have, and being able to work on them in a efficient and timely manner.
Very
I actually have 2 questions that have come in right now. So the first one is, do you know of a good resource for a template for an incident response plan?
No, so I am a strong believer in NIST guidance. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Now, it's a government organization, and a lot of their work that they do is directed at government entities. They actually have a publication around incident response plan and computer incident handling. Now, with that said, I will warn you, it's a fairly in-depth piece of literature that you can use and consult. With that said, I will tell you this: an incident response plan should not be complicated. It should not be lengthy. There's no requirement for that. Start off very simple, right? Put yourself in a room and run a simple exercise like a tabletop. And usually you can partner with folks like Defendify, who can help you build out these incident response plans and these tabletop exercises. Just run through a simple scenario and build out your plan accordingly, right? Let's say one of your employees had their credentials lost, stolen, and all of a sudden a bad guy got into their email account. What are the steps you would take? How would you go about handling that incident? And build it out from there. This is not a one-time fix. This is not okay, I'm going to do this project once and be done with it. Having an incident response plan is something you want to test every quarterly or every 6 months, make updates to it, expand it, and keep going. It's a continuous process. And so, but by no means do you make it overly complicated.
Shanna, was there another question you had?
There was. How should I check my vendors and partners on their cybersecurity posture?
That's a very, very good question. And that is sort of the $1 million question right now. So there's a couple of things I would suggest if you are wanting to look into what your vendors are doing. One, let's assume that you have a contract provision in there that says you have some right to be able to audit or have a right to inspect them. Right, let's assume that at the base case, that's a simple scenario where it says, in your contract with your supplier and vendor, it includes that. There's a couple options for you. One, you can actually go through and do an audit by yourself, right? Ask your supplier to provide you with documentation, their policies and procedures, showing the 4 corners of their information security program and what that looks like. I know a lot of you are thinking, well, I'm too busy running my own business. I don't have time to go and do that for my vendor. And you'd be absolutely correct. So which brings us to the second option. You can hire a third-party auditor. There's a lot of companies out there that do these types of third-party audits, and you can hire them to go do an audit of your vendor. Or if that's not even feasible, the third option is sometimes certain companies will go through independent audits by themselves as part of their ongoing program, information security program, and they'll get audit reports. There's various types of reports out there, and what you can do is ask them for copies of those reports. Ask them for copies of any assessments that they've gone through when it comes to cybersecurity, and you can start using those to build up your position, your oversight over your vendors. So that's one. So hopefully that answers your questions, but if not, please feel free to ask more questions and hopefully I get you the answer you wanted.
That's great, Sid. All right, we're going to play What If, Sid. I hope this is
Sure.
going to be okay for you. I never want to put you on the spot, but I've set up sort of a really most popular sort of scenario that's going on. So I want to play what if. All right. So your company was just hit with ransomware, and let's say that they do believe that the adversaries got access to sensitive information, and maybe they took that sensitive information and then dropped the ransomware there and sort of locked things up. And maybe there's even communication going on saying along the lines of, we have the sensitive information. What are the legal steps that organization needs to take? Where do you go? Where should they go first?
Rob, that's a excellent question. And for those of you on the call today, this is how you build out a sample incident response or do a tabletop exercise. Start with this simple fact right here. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, but just think about the questions and what Rob asked you, right? What steps would you take? No need to worry about the legal steps, but what steps would you take? But Rob, to your question, what legal steps would you take? First off, a ransomware attack can be devastating, right? To a lot of organizations, when their day-to-day business is brought to a halt, oftentimes that has very dire and significant consequences. So the first thing I counsel companies is on when it comes to ransomware attack is, figure out what the nature and the scope of the incident is, right? How much of their infrastructure has been compromised? What types of options do you have? Do you have great backups in place? What is your backup and restore process? How much time and effort is that gonna take? The second thing is, what is the nature of the ransomware? Right, some ransomwares are they don't exfil data, right? So if you have a situation where the data is not exfilled, great. But in this case, in your hypo, it seems like we have a situation where data can be exfiltrated. In that type of situation, you might have reporting obligations. Let's say you're a hospital, for example, under the HIPAA rules, which governs a lot of which governs the protection of protected health information, or PHI. There is an assumption, if you will, that during a ransomware attack, the bad guys have had access to PHI, and as a consequence of that, you have to report to potentially impacted individuals. So your next steps now is to be able to assess the scope of any potential information that could have been compromised and determine what those reporting obligations are. You might have to report to the impacted individuals. You might have to report to your business partners. You might have to report to like a regulatory body or a state's attorney general, notifying them of the data breach. So being able to assess that scope of the incident is going to be very important. And then, the other angle of this is actually running the negotiations, right? Often it's funny. The reason why ransomware incidents are so successful or are so prolific is because they are genuinely successful. And we constantly have to negotiate with the bad guys out there. And sometimes there's tendencies to say, we don't negotiate with terrorists, so take the position that if we do negotiate with the bad guys, we're just incentivizing that. And you guys would be absolutely right with that mindset. But understand that sometimes companies are in such a position where they have to do that. Maybe their backups have failed, or the backups themselves were compromised, and they have no recourse but to try and get the ransomware key back from the bad guys. And so running through that negotiation, understanding how the bad guys negotiate, those are other things to be cognizant of as well.
What are your thoughts on the U.S. Department of Treasury, talking about sanctions, and if you pay those ransomware payments to those sanctioned countries and so on? Have you bumped into that yet?
You know what? That's a great question, and we did bump into it. So for those of you who are not familiar, there's a new guidance from the OFAC that says that sometimes paying ransomware amounts, if you pay money that's for a ransom, some of that money could be directed towards illicit activities like terrorism. And when you do that, you potentially end up in a situation where you've violated law. So if you're a company that's going in the midst of a ransomware attack and you are actually contemplating payment of the ransom, you might inadvertently step into this minefield of violating U.S. law here, when all you're trying to do is get into a position of trying to get your systems back online.
So how would a company even know that?
That's a great question, and it becomes very fact sensitive. There is no sort of rule of thumb to follow. It really just depends on who you're negotiating with, how it's going, and so it becomes very, very fact sensitive. And not to make this like a shameless plug for an attorney, but you really do want to make sure that you run that by counsel of your pro-choice to make sure that, yes, you're not running afoul of any of these OFAC rules, for example, or not inadvertently stepping into a minefield where you could be accused of funding terrorism, for example.
Right. Yeah, it's such a valid point in the sense that, every time you pay ransomware, you are paying either terrorists or cyber criminals, and you keep funding their activity. And that's why we keep seeing this thing continuing to grow and happening over and over and over again. That continues. We're not going to get out of that mess.
Nope.
You know what's going to lead me to now is, okay, so we talked about an incident occurring, being prepared for it all. All right, let's say it did happen, talking on the legal side. How about cyber insurance? If this happens, it can cost hundreds of thousands. Bigger organizations could cost millions of dollars if you include downtime and the whole bit. Are you seeing cyber insurance being a successful option? And what does the market look like on the cyber insurance side? And the last thing I want to share is we hear on occasion from people who say, I don't need cybersecurity because I have insurance. I'd love to hear from you, Sid, on all those items.
Those are all great questions. I think we could probably spend an entire day talking about just cyber insurance alone. Cyber insurance is becoming very, very essential and a cornerstone of every information security program, and not just in information security, but just across overall risk for a company, for an organization. I think we talked about this before as well, Rob. Most of us here have, for example, auto insurance or homeowners insurance. And regardless of which carrier we go get that insurance from, the paper that governs that relationship is almost identical because there have been so many years of disputes and insurance disputes where people sort of understand what types of coverages that they're getting, what types of coverages that they're not getting. Right. You switch over to cyber insurance, though, it's still the wild, wild west. Even though it's been the better part of a decade that cyber insurance has sort of been mainstream, there's still a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. So when you as a company are going to go to and obtain cyber insurance, it's important for you to understand what your risks are and making sure you get coverages that are appropriate for that risk. So let's say you are a company that has a lot of personal information. You want to make sure that you have coverages for the loss of data, right? Or let's say, conversely, you are a manufacturing company. You're a manufacturing business. You don't have a lot of data, but maybe you just are more you're in the business of making widgets. And if you suffer an incident, chances are you have to halt your supply chain, your manufacturing chain. In those types of situations, you want to look for insurance that's going to cover your loss of business or any business interruption there. The takeaway that I would always suggest is, actually, I'll give you a little anecdote. A colleague of mine, he likes to always tell me, he specializes in insurance. He says, people that don't understand cyber insurance buy cyber insurance the way people who don't understand wine buy wine at a restaurant. And what that means is, they don't want the highest qualities because it's too expensive, so they don't buy it. And they don't want to look cheap, so they don't buy the cheapest. So just go with the middle of the tier. And that's always a challenge, especially in cyber insurance, because you might end up in a situation where you think you have coverage for a particular type of incident or a particular type of event. And when you go to file a claim, you don't have coverage there because you didn't properly read the fine language. So understand what types of coverages you have and what types of exclusions you have there. And I think one of the questions, Rob, you asked was, a lot of people saying, well, it's not so much as having good cyber security as long as it's having good cyber insurance. Well, I don't think that's really relevant anymore, because a lot of times as you go through the underwriting process to be able to get cyber insurance, your insurer is going to ask you very specific questions, much like you might get your customers, right? That information security questionnaire that you might see from a customer is not going to come from insurers as well, because they want to know what type of risk that they're underwriting. So let's say you go through and answer that questionnaire, or you're not very accurate in responding to that questionnaire. You might find up in a situation where when you go make a claim, the insurance pulls out the responses to the questionnaire that you provided and said, well, you told us you're going to have full disk encryption across your infrastructure, but then now you're filing a claim because a lost hard drive gave rise to a data breach. Well, we're not going to cover this incident, right? So it's important for you to understand, yes, cyber insurance is great, But more and more what we're seeing is the trend is cyber insurance is also being tied to the scope of your information security program and how good of a job you do when it comes to information security.
Right. We've seen cases where they're denying ransomware claims because of active war, right? Coming from another country, right?
Absolutely. It's there's actually ongoing cases on that right now, and this goes back to a couple of years ago. So for a lot of you might recall, there was a ransomware incident called NotPetya. It compromised the update process of the Ukrainian MEDOC software to insert destructive malware. And that was one of those situations where it leveraged NSA exploits as well. Now, what happened was there's another company that suffered a ransomware, a large multinational company. They suffered a ransomware incident and they went to file against their insurer. They went and filed a claim with their insurer, and the insurer denied the claim. The insurer said, yes, you have cyber insurance, but your cyber insurance had an exclusion for acts of war.
Mm-hmm.
And the insurer is of the position that the ransomware incident that was suffered by this company was an act of war, and so it's not going to be covered. So that's being disputed right now in courts, and it's still ongoing. But that's just another great example, right? You want to be careful of what types of coverages you have, what types of exclusions you have, and making sure that you understand fully the risks that you have. This is going to be something that, if you're going through the process of getting cyber insurance, it's not going to be done just within your IT team or just within your cybersecurity team. It's going to be across the board, with key stakeholders from various parts of the business who really truly understand the full scope of risk that could arise in a cybersecurity incident, and making sure you have coverages for that.
So it sounds like you're going to recommend that, an attorney should be involved in reviewing some of these things at times.
An attorney and your information security professionals, and folks like Defendify, if you work with them, right? If you have a managed security services provider that you partner with, you want them at the table too, so to help educate you on the types of risks, the types of controls you have. Making sure you have those good partnerships is going to be important as you go through the process.
Oh, that's great, Sid. Good information for everyone here who's listening.
We do have a question here about, can having more cyber protections reduce my cyber policy premium?
That's a great question. It depends on your insurer. Some insurers will take that into account. Will give you, I wouldn't say credit, but will basically determine your coverages and your deductibles based on the type of an information security program you have, what type of maturity you have. So the short answer is yes. Long answer, a little bit longer answer is it depends on the insurer.
Sid, it is Wild West out there. Sometimes these applications are, what's your revenue, how many employees and locations, and other ones have like a deep dive into your security posture. It's just it's a little odd, but I guess they each go at it in a different way.
It is. It truly is, and it's again, I can't stress this enough. Make sure you truly understand what you're buying, because you don't want to be in a situation where you come to file a claim, because chances are it was dire circumstances when you're trying to file a claim and you turns out you don't have it. One of the things that we've noticed with cybersecurity policies and insurance providers is, when it comes to an incident, one of the things they like to do, the insurers often like to use their own short list of vendors or law firms. So for those of you out here on the call today who are thinking about procuring cyber insurance, something to consider is whether or not you want to partner with a particular law firm or a particular cybersecurity forensics company. So where that comes in is, let's say you have a data breach and you want to hire a forensics company. Depending on your policy, your insurer might tell you, okay, you can only use a short list. But let's say you had been partnering Rob and Defendify forever, and and each of you have a good understanding of the other, and you want Rob and Defendify to come in and do the forensics. You want to make sure that your policy covers that, right? So you want to have an endorsement in there to have Defendify come in and do the forensics. Something to consider. I think it's a small thing, but it can be really, really tactically useful when you are actually in the middle of an incident. So just keep that in mind for those of you who are thinking about getting insurance today.
Great tip. Sid, every once in a while we go back and forth about different cases that you're following and so on. I'd love to hear if there's any interesting cybersecurity related cases that you could share.
Sure. One of the things that I've been following lately is the use of what's called cybersecurity forensics reports that come out of an incident. There's the idea, what it's tied to is the concept of privilege. So usually when we have clients that have an incident, we tell them, if you're going to hire a forensics company to do the work, you want to make sure that it's your lawyer, the law firm that retains the forensics company, because that way the work that the forensics company does can be cloaked under attorney-client privilege or some sort of privilege. The reason for that is you want to be able to protect that work that's being done under that privilege, and because you might have down the road, you might end up in litigation, or you might have attorney general or some sort of regulatory agency coming in and taking a look. And by protecting it, you sort of you give yourself a little bit of coverage, if you will, on what that information is and how it's used. There's a line of case that's going on that deals with whether or not the work that a cybersecurity company does or a forensics company does, and the report that they produce is the report that they generate out of that incident, that root cause analysis, whether or not that is in fact protected by privilege. And why this is important is because it can completely alter the complexion of any potential litigation that you as a company might encounter down the road. So let's say, for example, you hire a forensics company, they write a report that basically trashes your information security program. All of a sudden, that report could end up on some other on the other side, and they're going to use that as an arrow against you to say, "Hey, you did not have good information security here. Your forensics firm determined that by after they did their analysis, and so you're going to be liable for this security incident, and this is why we're suing you." So it's going to be this line of cases is really, really interesting. I know I'm going down this lawyer tangent here, but the big takeaway is be careful if you're an MSP, for example, or if you're thinking about getting an MSP. Consider who's going to do that work, how that work is going to be done, and how what the output of that engagement is. Are there going to be a report? Should there be a report? Is it going to be done under privilege? Those are important considerations because they could have significant ramifications for you down the road.
So in this case that you're talking about, are you saying that someone had an incident, forensic team went in, and somebody before the forensic team went in, they were actually hired by the attorney group then they went in and did the forensics on behalf of the attorney group to protect that client privileged information? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. So usually what we encourage clients is, let's say they do suffer an incident, let's say a data breach, and they'll engage a law firm. And what we tell them is you want to have the law firm engage the forensics firm for you, because that forensics firm is working at the direction of legal counsel.
Got it.
And so the work that the forensics firm would be doing would be covered under, assuming everything is done right, is potentially covered under attorney-client privilege or some level of privilege. And you want to be able to, and that the reason for that is it gives you certain protections when it comes to who can get access to that information and what they can do with that information.
Right.
So it benefits you, especially if you feel like this data breach, for example, could lead to litigation.
Comes right back to that incident response plan, having that plan in place and knowing when to contact them. That's excellent. Thanks for sharing that with us. I think it's a great thing to think about. I think one of the interesting parts about this conversation we've been having is around who you work with. I think a lot of people just say cybersecurity is an IT thing, and the IT folks deal with it. Can you share a little bit around who are you working with at client organizations who are dealing with cybersecurity and data security issues?
That's a great point. I feel like we're sort of fortunate, Rob, when it comes to cybersecurity, in that I've always felt we can integrate into various different parts of the organization, because depending on the organization, somebody has the involvement there. We constantly get engaged by non-IT teams. Actually, if you had to ask, I'd say and more often than not, we get engaged outside of the IT function or outside of the cybersecurity function. So usually the CEO or the CFO or the compliance officer is the one that's reaching out and saying, "Hey, we need this additional help." And obviously, there's constantly something that where we are also engaged by the IT function or the cybersecurity function, and so it really just sort of depends on who in the company is responsible for that risk and how they want to manage it. Sometimes just based on reporting structures, it finds out that the CFO, for example, has oversight or has accountability for cybersecurity at a company, and so the CFO is the one responding or reaching out to us. Or sometimes it's a little bit more of the traditional model where you have the CIO or the CISO that's directing this work, and they're the ones that are usually coming to us. Like I'm sure you've probably seen something similar to that, Rob, just kind of given the type of work that you guys do with Defendify.
I think the awareness is changing. So if you go back a few years ago, the thought was always that it's the IT person's responsibility to have cybersecurity in place, and there has definitely been a shift where the C-suite and the senior level sort of business leaders are starting to realize that now they play a role in cybersecurity, not just the IT leaders or IT folks who work in the IT professionals. It's everyone's responsibility. Are you seeing that change as well?
I do. I think there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing an increase in scrutiny from the C-suite, if you will. More and more, just sort of the change in law, for example, is driving this, but also just overall accountability. We've seen numerous cases where publicly traded companies, their shareholders are pissed off when their company gets a data breach, and they're looking at the board level personnel to say, "Hey, how come we don't have any accountability or who has oversight over this?" And so increasingly, we are seeing executive level leadership taking a bigger stake in cybersecurity of the overall company. And I'm really happy to see, going back to my IT days, it was always thought of, cybersecurity as being sort of an IT function. And I'm really thrilled to see that that's not the case anymore. And they're starting to recognize that it is a company problem and not just an IT problem.
Yeah, I think no matter how you look at the IT leaders in an organization need to be at the table with the other business leaders as well and driving that forward, or else those organizations are going to end up not doing things appropriately.
Yep.
Giving them the budgets and driving it forward as a business activity. All right, so I'm going to ask for you to give us a few tips. So if a small to mid-sized organization came to you and said, "Hey, we really want to get our cybersecurity in check. We want to make sure that we're checking the boxes properly." I'm sure from your perspective, there's many things that they should do, but maybe you can give us 3 key steps. What would you recommend they do as a first step here?
Sure. And let me, before I give my answer, let me just preface this, right? This is not a one size fits all, right? Every organization is unique. Every organization has something that's special about them. So just keep that in mind. So with that said, here's my sort of suggestions, and it'll sort of hinge on what we've talked about before, right? Start with insurance, right? If you don't have cyber insurance right now, and you feel like that is a big risk for you, cybersecurity is a big unknown to you, or issues that the risks that could come out of a data breach, think about obtaining cyber insurance. Go through the proper channels, engage a broker, if you will. Make sure that you have some understanding of what you're buying, and go ahead and get cyber insurance. The second thing I would suggest is do an assessment, if you will. It doesn't have to be a risk assessment. It doesn't have to be a full-blown audit, but start taking deliberate steps to sort of assess your information security posture, right? And you don't have to make this complicated. You can do little things that go a long way. So let's say you use Office 365. Ask yourselves, what kind of security controls do you have in Office 365? What are the steps you can do to bolster up? Do you have MFA, for example? Start with simple controls, very basic controls, and go from there. I've had this conversation many of times. People seem to think that cybersecurity is a set in it and forget it mentality, and that's not the case. This is about continuous improvement, evolution. It's sort of a road to perfection as opposed to a target goal. And you want to embark on that somewhere, and you can start simply and easily by doing the little things like, okay, just do a little bit of an initial assessment, say, okay, what are the things I need to be worried about? What type of security controls I have? How am I handling my risk? So start small. And the third thing is, like we talked about earlier, have a great incident response plan in place. What is that? What do you do if you find yourselves in the middle of an incident response plan? Are you going to engage a company like Defendify to help you do the forensics? If you would, how do you go about doing that? Having a great incident response plan is never a bad thing, right? Every organization should have a great incident response plan and should know how to exercise that incident response plan when an incident occurs.
I think those are great tips. I love the assessment one as well. We see quite often, organizations coming to us and saying, they'll just walk in and say, I want this one specific tool or module, and we might be offering that in Defendify. And we turn to them right away and say, have you ever done an assessment on your cybersecurity posture? And quite often the answer is like, no, but I want that one tool. And we take them right back to say, you should really do like a holistic overview, a comprehensive review of your cyber posture, and then start to decide which tools should be in place and based on budget and what you need to fix. I think that's some great advice. Thank you.
Yeah, and Rob, I think we've talked about before. I think you get Defendify has a lot of great capabilities, and to the folks on the call today, if you find yourself in a position where you're not comfortable discussing these topics because you don't know what's north and what's south, there's a lot of resources and a lot of great companies like Defendify who are there to help you, right? There's no sort of shame in reaching out and saying, hey, I don't even know what questions to ask. There are so many times when I have had a client call me up and say, listen, I just know this is a risk. I just don't even know what questions to ask. And at that point, it's a matter of just having a conversation and educating, because cybersecurity is complicated. Cybersecurity is not simple, and it changes so much. So having folks like Defendify that you can fall back on, having a resource that you can tap to be able to help answer your questions, leverage those resources, because you'll find yourself much more comfortable being able to navigate the complexities here.
Yeah, great.
Speaking of assessments, I talked to a customer the other day who said that they let their insurance broker fill out their cybersecurity questionnaire when they were trying to get cyber insurance. I think I'm still injured from when I fell out of my chair.
That's definitely an issue. So, for the folks on the call, you might work with a cybersecurity broker. Hopefully, that broker knows you very, very intimately before you let them answer questions for you. Because if they answer questions incorrectly, or not to say they're doing that deliberately, but they might inadvertently make a representation on those questionnaires that they didn't mean to, when it comes to you filing a claim against that policy, you might get rejected because of the answers that were provided on that response.
I think it goes back to that cybersecurity can feel complicated. I do have one more question here that says, I know how important cybersecurity is, but it's tough for me to explain that to our non-technical leadership team. How can I help them see it so I can get more budget?
You know what? That is a great question, and that is probably the other $1 million question. I don't have a perfect answer for you. Cybersecurity, going back to my IT days, it's always about influence, persuasion, and sort of getting people to understand that there's a dimension of risk here that you might not have contemplated before. And so it's, again, you're right. People call it different things. People call it like a cybersecurity champion or an information security champion. But sort of having a deliberate focus towards influence and persuasion and education of the rest of the organization, I think that's going to be essential. One of the things that I found really successful is doing training, getting people to go through cybersecurity and privacy training, simple things like phishing tests, and understand, how a simple phishing email can introduce a whole scope of risk to an organization, and trying to deliver that in sort of tangible, measurable incidents that have real world impact. I think that's one good way to bring about change. But otherwise, it's just a matter of having conversations, continuing to focus on it, continuing to reiterate, because it really is sometimes incredibly hard to go into an organization and start to try to raise the information security acumen when people don't really understand what it is. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer there, but that's kind of what my thoughts are. Sorry, Jenna, what did you say?
Yeah, well, risk is hard because it's like one of those things where if I shell out this money and everything works the way that it's supposed to, nothing happens. So how do we know it was because we had good cyber protections, or how do we know it was because we just weren't going to be a target to begin with? But what are some examples of, like, I think it's important to translate that into whoever you're talking to, if it's like the CFO, translated into financial terms, the things that matter to them in their role. Like, what are some tangible, like, losses or actual, like, business impacts that you've seen to clients that have had cyber attacks?
Sure. One of the, we always talk about in cybersecurity, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. All that to say is, it's not a question of whether or not you will be hit. You will be hit. The question is when. One of the most useful examples I take is ransomware. And even just recently, the FBI put out this ransomware prevention and guidance for CISOs. There's a great document out there. You can just Google it. But really talks about how the proliferation of ransomware is something that everybody needs to be cognizant of. There's more than 4,000 ransomware attacks that occur daily since 2016. If you look at the guidance, and that's about a 300% increase of what they saw in previous years. Now, if you take something like ransomware, and people take that and make it tangible to folks that are not technically savvy, right? Get them to understand, okay, imagine if you don't have access to your computer, or imagine if the company's IT has to shut down for an extended period of time. What are the types of consequences that stem from that? What are the losses that we would be subject to? How much of a reputational risk, do we how much of a reputational risk do we take a hit on? Those are important considerations, and I think ransomware is a great example. And there's lots of guidance out there that helps you reiterate the facts of how prolific it is, the cost of recovering from it, and hopefully that helps drive the message home on why it's so important.
Sid, tell us how we can reach you if one of the listeners here wants to get in touch with you and talk about their cybersecurity or bounce some questions off you. What's the best way to reach you?
Sure. Well, I always tell my clients it's never a good day when you have to talk to me. But if you ever do want to talk to me, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. You can reach me on email, sid.bose@icemiller.com. If anybody prefers a Twitterverse, you can, I am Sid Bose. You can use that Twitter handle. But otherwise, if you just go on the Ice Miller site, you can type my name. You can find it as well. So it's on your slide that you see there.
Sid, I think I've done maybe 5 or 6 different talks with you, and every time I learn something new from you. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your legal knowledge with everybody who's joining us here. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I always have a great time doing these sessions with you, and it's just fun to have these conversations. So thank you guys very much for putting this, and thank you for having me.